start my outfeed table project, I went ahead and grabbed 3 sheets of plywood. Now, if you've ever had problems moving plywood around by yourself, the speed skate makes that a lot easier. Once I had my plywood in place, I started laying out my dimensions and grabbed my track saw to start breaking down the sheets. I like to use a track saw in combination with the table saw because it makes it a lot easier to break down those really large pieces that then I can fine tune at the table saw. I'm also using the Jessam table saw stock guides as I do this. They really help, especially with larger pieces, give me a helping hand in ensuring that the pieces stay nice and tight against the fence. One thing that's nice about the stock guides is once I have them set, because I'm using the same thickness of material, I don't have to keep resetting those, so it's a one and done. You'll also notice I'm labeling each of my pieces. This is something I always do, that way I don't accidentally get one piece mixed up with the other. So I've got bottom, back, front, and so forth. Here I'm ripping all the strips that are actually going to be the braces for the top. And I'm cutting them to length using my Incrometer 5000 and a stop. In the back panel of my cabinet, my braces will actually extend beyond, and these will give a little offset so I can get the table nice and close to the back of the table saw. To do this, I'm marking out each of those locations, and then I threw my Infinity Detonator stacked dado blade in the saw and set it up as close as I could, made a test cut, and checked it in its width. I found it was a little bit too narrow, and my two pieces wouldn't notch together properly. So I grabbed my shim set, found the right thickness shim, threw it in the stack, and made another cut. And when I put the two pieces together, you'll see that they fit together perfectly nice and snug. The only problem is my braces are 3 inches tall and I can't quite cut that high with the detonator, so I finished this notch up at the bandsaw, just cutting to a line. Once I had my template made, I grabbed a 1/4 inch spiral flush trim bit and used that to cut the notches for each of the braces. I'd used a couple of Irwin quick grip clamps to secure my template. They made it really easy just to slap the template in place, get it lined up with my marks, and cut my pockets. You can see with the test fit, because I used a 1/4 inch radius bit to make the notches, I had that little round over at the end. So rather than go through and square that up with a chisel, I grabbed an 1/8 inch radius round over bit and rounded over the 2 edges of my braces at the router table. You can see with those 2 edges rounded over, it fits into the pocket perfectly and is nice and flush with the top edge of my cabinet box. With all my pieces cut out, it's time to start adding the joinery. To put my cabinet together, I'm using simple pocket screw joinery. For this, I really like using the Craig K5 because it has those 2 nice extension wings and really makes it easy when adding pocket holes to relatively large panels for the cabinet. Once I had those pocket screws drilled, I was over to assembling the cabinet and using some of the Craig corner clamps and the pocket hole clamp. This is the one that fits into that little pocket hole and helps keep those 2 pieces nice and aligned. For me, this is the key to getting really nice flush joinery with pocket screws. With the front and back panels on, it's time to cut the inner division panels to size. These are going to divide the main cabinet into 3 different compartments. To do this, I just rip up a sheet on the table saw, add some pocket screws on all 4 edges. The pocket screws on the top edge are going to be used to help attach the tabletop to the cabinet itself. With everything cut to size and the pocket screw holes added, I just clamp it up, make sure everything is lined up nice and square, and drive the screws home. These 2 internal division panels really add a great deal of strength to the cabinet and ensure that I'm going to have a really nice flat tabletop at the very end of the day. Really, this is creating almost a semi torsion box style construction to support my top, because ultimately that's my number one goal, is to ensure that I have an extremely flat top for my outfeed table that's not going to be inclined to sag ever. Next, it's time to install all the cross braces in the table that are going to support the top. You can see we've already got all the notches cut for those. And here I'm adding just a couple of pocket screws for each notch. That's going to grab that one end of the brace. And I've already drilled pocket screws in the opposite end, so it's a matter of clamp them in on that one side, drive those pocket screws home, make sure everything's aligned properly, and I'll end up with a really sturdy cabinet with a nice solid top. The last step, once I have all the braces in place, is to simply attach a cross piece that just covers up the ends of those braces. To do this, I just drive pocket screws straight through that piece into the ends of the braces. I also added a strip across the front of that main cabinet area just to close it off and give me a place to attach my center brace. Brace is done. I added a strip of about 3-inch wide, 3/4 inch plywood all the way around the bottom of the cabinet. This beefed up the bottom of the cabinet just a bit, gave it a little bit of a thicker aesthetic, and gave me 1.5-inch thickness for my leveling feet to attach to. Once I had those strips in place with just a few screws, I added 4 holes for my leveling feet. I actually ended up adding 2 more leveling feet in the center later on, just to make sure that nothing had a chance of sagging. But the leveling feet do a great job at letting me get the cabinet itself perfectly level with the top of the table saw. Then I grabbed the top material for my saw. It's a 1-inch thick MDF with a micro dot laminate, and I wanted to wrap that edge with an edge banding, so I grabbed a piece of hickory from the stash and just cut it to size, roughly 1.25 inches tall by 3/4 of an inch thick. I ran a 1/4 inch groove all the way around the top itself and added a spline to attach the edge banding to this top. So this is just a 1/4 inch slot cutter. I made 1/4 inch strips of the hickory, cut them with a miter, and I cut them a little bit short just to ensure that I didn't have any interference when I went to glue everything up. Use that same 1/4 inch slot cutter at the table saw and a pair of Jessam clear cut stock guides and a Bow Products feather board or Feather Pro to ensure that I got a really even, consistent 1/4 inch groove in my edge banding. And I located that groove so it left just a little bit of the edge banding sitting above the table surface. And this will give me the ability to come back later with a flush trim bit and make that edge banding perfectly flush with the top surface of the table. To join the corners of my edge banding, I decided to make a half lap rather than a miter. To do this, I used a 1/4 kerf blade at the table saw to make that little half lap rabbet. It'll hide that 1/4 inch groove for the edge banding, and it pops nicely into place and looks nicely finished. Even though this is a piece of shop furniture, I decided to go ahead and use those little plugs and plug the exposed pocket holes on the cabinet. I think this really makes it look a lot nicer when everything's said and done. I also decided to use an 1/8 inch radius round over and round over all the edges on my cabinet doors. Even though they're just a plain 3/4 inch plywood slab, rounding over that edge makes them a lot nicer, both in appearance and in use, because I don't have any sharp edges when I go to open and close the cabinet doors. While the glue was drying on my edge banding, I went ahead and attached the top itself to the cabinet using all those pre-drilled pocket holes that I had made earlier to drive those screws. So I've got quite a number of screws holding the top to the cabinet, and this really ensures that that top is not going to sag or move around ever, and really actually adds rigidity to the whole piece. When the glue was dry on the edge banding, I went back with a down cut spiral flush trim bit in my trim router and used that to make the edge banding perfectly flush with the top surface of the table. You could use either an upcut or a downcut bit for this. I decided to use a downcut because it pushed the material away from me and sheared off across the front edge of the top itself. With everything flushed up, I used a 45-degree chamfer bit to make a very large, about 3/8 inch tall chamfer all the way around the cabinet. This ensures that as I feed material across the table saw and onto the outfeed table, there's no chance of it catching on that edge and getting hung up, causing the possibility of kickback or other issues, especially on large pieces. Next, it's time to add the hinges to my cabinet doors. To do this, I'm using one of the Craig concealed hinge jigs, and it really does a nice job of getting those European style hinges installed. Here I'm just using a small pilot bit and it drills all 3 of my holes. I don't have to worry about it. And then I go ahead and use a standard screwdriver to drive those screws rather than a cordless tool, although screwdriver is a cordless tool. This ensures I don't strip those screws out accidentally. Then I can go ahead and locate those cabinet doors in the cabinet, and I just throw them up with a little spacer on the floor. This allows me to drill my pilot holes and install those screws. Once I have a couple of screws in each door, I can go back and really fine-tune the fit and get those doors located perfectly with nice gaps, nice reveals. This usually takes a little bit of trial and error, but with those European style hinges, you can get those doors pretty much absolutely perfect. So if you've never used them before, don't be afraid of them. With the doors installed, I went ahead and made a U-shaped channel. This is going to fit into the table and be a track where the miter gauge slides past the end of the table, and this is that channel where it fits into. Rather than just have a groove in the table with exposed MDF, I made this track, and to do that I used a 1 1/4 inch dado bit at the router table to make the actual track itself, and a 2-inch mega dado and planer bit with a large router base plate and a couple of pieces of plywood as my guides. And you can see just made a number of passes and keep checking the fit of my pre-made gutter until everything fit perfectly and it was nice and flush with the top edge of my table. Rather than try to square up the ends of those 2-inch wide grooves in the top, I decided to round over the ends of my gutters that I had made previously. To do this, I just drew the correct diameter circle on the ends of my gutters, trimmed them off at the bandsaw, and then sanded to my line at the belt sander. The belt sander is a great tool for this type of work. It can be quite accurate with just a little bit of practice. And you can see once I had them sanded up, I set them in the tracks and they fit just right. I was really happy with the way these turned out. Then it's just add a bit of glue in the bottom of the tracks, really to seal up that MDF, but it'll make sure these never come out. And then I just used a couple of brads to secure them in place, making sure where I put those brads, there was plywood structure underneath those. Once the glue was dry, I grabbed the 45-degree chamfer bit and trimmed off the ends of those tracks, making sure to set the height perfectly to match. And then I switched out for a brass pilot roundover bit and just rounded over those top edges so there's nowhere for anything to snag. The final step was to drill a hole at the ends of each of those miter tracks. This gives sawdust a place to go and not build up in those corners. I actually have a plan to add a little bit of dust collection at the bottom of the table to collect any of that dust and help pull it out of the way. Then I just traced out a nice gentle curve on some pieces of plywood that I had double-sided taped together and made 4 curved braces for those extended ends of the table. And I cleaned them up at the spindle sander, popped them apart, and attached those with some pocket screws to the table itself. Here I'm mixing up some General Finishes Tuscan red. Milk paint is the color that we use. It was Tuscan red. I think it looks great. It's kind of a barn red or brick red look, in my opinion. Really worked nicely with the black of the top, and also I used an oil on the edge banding, so really some nice contrast. Again, even though this is a piece of shop furniture, still want it to look good. Used the Erlax 5500 spray station to do my spraying. I did have to thin the milk paint quite a bit, even with a 2.5mm needle, because it is some really thick stuff when you go to spray it. And you can see we got this really sped up here for you, so you don't have to sit here and literally watch the paint dry. If you're liking our design for this outfeed table, be sure to head over to infinitytools.com. We've got a complete set of plans and measured drawings available for just a few bucks. You can download those and build your very own outfeed table for your shop. I ended up doing 2 coats of the General Finishes paint on all surfaces of the table and on the cabinet doors themselves. It dries super fast. I was able to do all the painting in just a couple of hours. It's really easy also to clean up and get it out of the gun, so no fancy solvents or anything are needed. It's just clean up with soap and water, quite literally. So here you can see I'm just plowing on my second coat. No problems with runs in any way on the whole project, so really happy with the finish and the way it turned out. Once the finish was dry, I let it dry overnight. The next day, I added the screws and reinstalled my hinges, and I added a couple of little door bumpers to the top and bottom corners of each of the doors. And so when the doors swing closed, the hinges kind of catch and pull them shut, and those door bumpers give the door a nice little thud rather than a real sharp clank and clatter noise when they close up. Because all my holes were already there, it's just a matter of putting the screws back in it and then taking a final pass over to make sure that my doors are properly aligned. I did make some drawers for these cabinets. They're 3 inches deep and made of 3/4 inch plywood sides, 1/2 inch plywood bottom, and they're just a simple half lap corner with a couple of screws in them. We have a multi-part series on how to build cabinets in the kitchen cabinet style, which this is very similar to, where we made finger jointed drawer boxes. I definitely recommend you check that out if you'd like some more information on how these types of drawers go together. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the description below for a complete list of all the tools we used to build this project, as well as a link to where you can download a set of plans for this project if you'd like to build one for your own. As always, don't forget to hit that like and share button and leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought of this project.